My name is Safia Rahman. I am 62 years old, and I live in a house that remembers everything. The walls remember my laughter when I was young. The floors remember my tears when no one was watching. The doors remember how many times I was silenced before I ever learned how to speak for myself. This house is old. Not broken, old. There is a difference. Every morning, sunlight slips through the narrow windows and falls gently across the living room, touching the faded sofa, the carved wooden table, and the framed photographs that no one looks at anymore. Dust dances in the air like memories that refuse to settle. I wake up before everyone else. I always have. Not because I need to, but because habit becomes survival when a woman spends her life adjusting herself around others. I make tea quietly. I walk softly. I exist carefully. This house once belonged to my father-in-law, Haji Abdul Rahman, a man whose voice was firm but fair. He believed a home was sacred. He believed family was a responsibility, not a convenience. When he died, the house passed to my husband, Yusuf Rahman. And when Yusuf died, people assumed it would naturally pass to my son. People always assume a woman is temporary. I was married at 19. Back then, I had dreams. Not extraordinary ones, just simple dreams. I wanted to study literature. I loved books, stories, words. I believed words could save people. Life had other plans. Yusuf was a good man, but goodness does not always mean understanding. He worked long hours, came home tired, and believed providing was the same as caring. I learned early that love, for women like me, was something we gave, not something we expected. Still, I built a life. I gave birth to Arsalan after 5 years of marriage. The day he was born, I felt like the world finally gave me a reason that was entirely mine. I poured everything into him. My education faded into the background. My ambitions softened. My voice lowered. People praised me for being a good mother. No one asked what it cost. Years passed. Arsalan grew into a confident, ambitious man. He was intelligent, sharp, and charming when he wanted to be. He learned early how to speak in a way that made people listen. I was proud of him. Fiercely proud. When Yusuf passed away suddenly, heart failure at 56, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. Grief arrived quietly and stayed loudly. Arsalan became my world, and I became his shadow. For a while, we survived together. Then he met Maya. Maya was beautiful in a way that demanded attention. Educated, modern, confident. She spoke quickly, thought quickly, and judged quickly. At first, she was polite to me. Politeness, I would later realize, is not kindness. After marriage, she moved into our house. That was when the house began to feel smaller. Mrs. Safia, she called me. Never Ammi. Never mother. Mrs. Safia, the furniture is outdated. Mrs. Safia, this house feels depressing. Mrs. Safia, parents should respect boundaries. Boundaries. A word that entered my life late and was used only against me. Arsalan listened. Not openly at first, but slowly. Subtly. Like water wearing down stone. Rooms changed. Furniture moved. My belongings were relocated without asking. My presence became optional. I noticed the way conversations stopped when I entered the room. I noticed how decisions were made without me. I noticed how invisible I was becoming. One evening, Arsalan sat across from me at the dining table. "Me?" he said, not looking at me. "We should transfer the house papers to my name." The spoon froze in my hand. "Why?" I asked. "It's just a formality," he replied. "For security. For the future." I looked at him, the boy I raised, the man I trusted. "This house is an amanat," I said softly. "It belonged to your grandfather. Then your father. It is still mine." His jaw tightened. For the first time in my life, I saw irritation in his eyes when he looked at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt restless. Things escalated quickly after that. Arguments became louder. Respect became conditional. I was reminded, constantly, that I was old, dependent, outdated. Maya stopped hiding her resentment. "You're holding us back," she said once. "This house could be sold. We could live better." I wondered when a mother became an obstacle. Then came the day that changed everything. It was raining. I remember because rain always made Yusuf quiet, and I thought of him that day. The argument started over something small. It always does. Voices rose. Words sharpened. And suddenly, Arsalan grabbed my arm, not violently, but firmly. Possessively. "You don't understand," he said. "This house is ours." I was pushed into the storage room. The door closed. The lock clicked. Darkness. Silence. In that silence, something inside me broke, and something else was born. I sat on the cold floor, listening to my own breathing. This was not how my story was supposed to end. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed the wall. A loose brick. A memory surfaced. Yusuf once told me there were documents hidden in the house. "Just in case," he had said. With trembling hands, I removed the brick. Behind it was a metal box. Inside were papers that told a different story. A dangerous story. A story that could change everything. The metal box was heavier than it looked. I pulled it closer, my fingers stiff from the cold, my heart pounding like it was trying to warn me. The lock was old, rusted at the edges, but it opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside were documents wrapped in yellowed cloth. Deeds. Letters. Legal papers. And at the bottom, a small leather-bound notebook. Yusuf's handwriting. I had not seen his writing in years. The sight of it made my chest tighten. He always wrote slowly, carefully, as if each word mattered. I opened the notebook. Safia. If you are reading this, then the world has shifted in ways I could not prevent. I swallowed hard. This house is not what people think it is. My breath caught. He wrote about his father, Haji Abdul Rahman. About how the house was built not just as a home, but as protection. How land disputes, family greed, and betrayal had shaped his generation. How trust, once broken, never truly healed. The documents revealed something shocking. The house was never fully transferred to Arsalan's grandfather alone. Part of it, legally, undeniably, was registered under my name. Not as a courtesy. Not as a mistake. As a safeguard. Yusuf had done it quietly, years ago, without telling anyone. Even me. "I knew our son," he wrote. "And I knew the world would teach him things I could not undo." Tears blurred my vision. Voices echoed upstairs. Maya was laughing. The sound cut through me, not because of jealousy, but because of the cruelty of it. While I sat locked in the basement of my own home, my son laughed above me. I stood up slowly. My legs shook, but my spine felt straighter than it had in years. For the first time, I was not powerless. Hours passed. I counted my breaths. I read the documents again and again, making sure grief was not turning words into lies. They had made a mistake. They thought silence meant surrender. Late at night, footsteps descended the stairs. The door opened. Arsalan stood there, avoiding my eyes. "You can come out," he said. "Let's not make this worse." I looked at him. Really looked at him. "This is already worse," I replied calmly. Something in my voice unsettled him. The next morning, I called a lawyer. My hands trembled as I dialed, but my voice did not. The lawyer's silence after reading the documents was long. Then he said, "Mrs. Rahman, you have more rights than you realize." Arsalan found out quickly. "You're doing this to hurt us," he accused. "No," I said quietly. "I'm doing this to survive." Maya's mask slipped. "You're selfish," she snapped. "Old people should know when to step aside." I smiled sadly. "And children should know when not to push." The house changed again. Not physically, but emotionally. Doors closed harder. Conversations turned sharp. Love became conditional. But fear had entered the room too. For the first time in decades, someone spoke to me as if I mattere. At night, I sat alone in my room, listening to the house breathe. It felt different. As if it recognized me again. As if it was waiting to see what I would do next. The legal process began. Slow. Exhausting. Public. Relatives called. Some supported me quietly. Others accused me openly. "How could you do this to your own son?" One evening, Arsalan stood outside my door. "I didn't think you'd go this far," he said. "I didn't think you'd lock your mother in a basement," I replied. Silence. Regret flickered across his face, but it was too late. That night, I made a decision. This was no longer just about a house. It was about dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, does not apologize. The first court notice arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly into an official envelope that felt heavier than paper had any right to be. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, as if the weight of it might tell me whether I was doing the right thing. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Arsalan and Maya had stopped speaking to me entirely. When they passed me in the hallway, their eyes slid away as if I were a stain on the wall. Silence had become their weapon. They believed it would make me retreat, the way it always had before. But silence only works when the other person is afraid of their own voice. I was not afraid anymore. I opened the letter and read it slowly, carefully, the way Yusuf used to read important things. The words were formal, cold, almost indifferent to the years of pain that had led to this moment. Dates. Times. Legal language. A confirmation that what had been done to me now had witnesses. I folded the letter and placed it back on the table. The house inhaled. That afternoon, Maya broke her silence. "You're humiliating us," she said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen while I washed lentils in a steel bowl. "People are talking." I didn't look up. People have always talked. This is different. No one asked how he did it to me. She snapped. Family matters shouldn't be dragged outside. I finally raised my eyes to her. Then family shouldn't lock family in basements. Her face hardened. "You're enjoying this," she said. I thought about that. About the sleepless nights, the shaking hands, the quiet terror of realizing your own child believes you are disposable. No, I said. I'm enduring it. News travels fast in families like ours. My sister-in-law called first. Then cousins. Then people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some spoke gently, carefully choosing words that balanced concern with judgment. Others were blunt. He's your son. You should forgive. What will people say? No one asked what forgiveness looks like when the wound is still bleeding. I listened. I thanked them. I ended the calls. Every conversation stripped away another layer of guilt I had carried my whole life. Guilt for taking space. Guilt for wanting respect. Guilt for not disappearing quietly. I began to understand how deeply I had been trained to erase myself. The lawyer advised me to document everything. Dates. Words. Actions. So I began to write. Not just facts, but feelings. I wrote about the first time Maya moved my things without asking. About the night Ursuline told me the house no longer felt like mine. About the sound of the lock clicking behind me in the basement. Writing did something strange. It didn't make the pain louder. It made it clearer. And clarity is dangerous to people who rely on confusion to keep control. Ursuline confronted me one evening in the living room. You've changed, he said, as if that were an accusation. Yes, I replied. I had to. This isn't who you are. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw a man struggling with the collapse of an image he had relied on his entire life, the obedient mother, the silent presence, the woman who would always bend. This is who I've always been, I said. You just never needed to see it before. His hands clenched into fists. You're tearing this family apart. I felt a deep, aching sadness, not for myself, but for him. No, I said softly. I'm refusing to hold it together alone. The first court hearing was brief, procedural, almost anticlimactic. Still, walking into that room felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. I sat straight. I spoke clearly. I did not lower my eyes. Across the room, Ursuline looked smaller than I remembered. Maya did not look at me at all. The judge listened. The lawyer spoke. Papers were passed. Words like ownership, rights, illegal confinement floated through the air, detached yet heavy. When we walked out, the sun was blinding. For a moment, I felt dizzy, not from fear, but from the realization that I had crossed a line there was no returning from. And I did not want to return. That night, I dreamed of Yusuf. He stood in the doorway of the old house, the way he used to when he came home late from work. He looked tired, but peaceful. You finally listened, he said. I was scared, I replied. He smiled gently. I know. When I woke up, my pillow was wet, but my chest felt lighter. The atmosphere in the house grew tense. Maya began packing things, loudly, deliberately, as if each box were a threat. Ursuline avoided me completely now. I could hear them whisper. Now it meant something else entirely. Late that night, Ursuline knocked on my door. I didn't invite him in. This has gone too far, he said, his voice low. We can still fix this. Fix it how? I asked. He hesitated. I already knew the answer. By making myself small again. No, I said. We are past fixing. Now we are facing. He looked at me then, not as a mother, not as an obstacle, but as someone he no longer understood. And in that moment, I understood something too. Sometimes, the greatest loss is not losing your child. It is realizing who they chose to become. The house exhaled. And this time, it did not sound tired. It sounded relieved. The house felt different after that night. Not calmer, just awake. It was as if something long buried had finally pushed its way to the surface, cracking through years of quiet obedience. I moved through the rooms more freely now. I did not ask permission to sit where I wanted. I did not lower the volume of my footsteps. These were small things, almost invisible, but they mattered more than grand speeches ever could. Power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it simply stops apologizing. Arsalan and Maya stopped pretending after that. The politeness vanished completely. Doors slammed. Cupboards were emptied with unnecessary force. Conversations happened in sharp whispers that cut through walls. I let them. Fear makes noise. Confidence does not need to. The second court date was approaching, and with it came a tension so thick it felt like humidity before a storm. Relatives began visiting, not to support, but to observe. They sat on sofas like spectators at a trial, eyes darting between me and my son, trying to decide where loyalty should land. One afternoon, my cousin's wife leaned close and said quietly, "You should settle this. He's your only son." I smiled gently. I was his only mother. She had no answer for that. Behind closed doors, Arsalan was unraveling. I could hear it in his voice when he spoke. On the phone, strained, defensive, impatient. He had always believed the world would bend for him if he spoke firmly enough. Now it wasn't. Maya grew sharper, more reckless. One evening, she cornered me in the hallway. "You think you've won," she said. "But even if the court rules in your favor, you'll still be alone." I studied her face. Young. Angry. Afraid. "I was alone long before this," I replied. "The difference is, now I know it." Her eyes flickered, not with guilt, but with uncertainty. That unsettled her more than anger ever could. That night, I sat in my room and reread Yusuf's notebook. One page near the end caught my attention. I had skimmed past it before, too overwhelmed to understand its weight. It mentioned money. Not just savings, but an account tied to the property. Funds set aside decades ago. Emergency funds, Yusuf had written. Protection funds. The next morning, I asked my lawyer about it. His reaction was immediate. "This changes things," he said. Apparently, that account had been used recently. Large withdrawals. Not by me. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with clarity. They hadn't just tried to take the house. They had already started treating it like loot. When confronted legally, Arsalan denied everything at first. Then, when the evidence was placed in front of him, his anger exploded. "So what?" he shouted. "It was family money." "It was not yours," the lawyer said calmly. I watched my son in that moment, really watched him, and something final settled in my chest. This was not a misunderstanding. This was entitlement. An entitlement does not negotiate. It takes. The court proceedings became uglier after that. Accusations flew. Maya cried dramatically. Arsalan claimed emotional distress. They painted me as confused, manipulated, bitter. I sat quietly and let them speak. Because every word they said only revealed more of who they were. When it was my turn, I spoke simply. I spoke about the basement, about the lock, about the fear. I did not exaggerate. I did not plead. I told the truth. The room was silent when I finished. The judge did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with respect. That day, a temporary order was issued. They were to vacate part of the house. Immediately. The look on Maya's face was unforgettable, not rage, not triumph, but shock. Real shock. The kind that comes when reality refuses to bend. Arsalan didn't speak to me at all. They packed that night. Boxes again. Loud again. But this time, the sound was hollow. When the door finally closed behind them, the house exhaled deeply. For the first time in years, the silence felt clean. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching walls, door frames, windows. Not claiming them, recognizing them. This place had witnessed my smallest humiliations and my quietest strengths. I had survived both. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. I began to sleep. Deeply. Without waking in fear. Neighbors smiled differently at me now. Some avoided eye contact. Others nodded with quiet approval. Women I barely knew stopped me to say, "You're brave." I didn't feel brave. I felt finished with being afraid. One evening, Arsalan called. His voice was tired. Smaller than I remembered. "I never thought it would end like this," he said. "Neither did I replied. Silence stretched between us. Then he said, "I don't recognize you anymore." I closed my eyes. "That makes two of us," I said softly. When the call ended, I did not cry. Grief still lived in me, but it no longer controlled me. Because grief, I had learned, is not the opposite of strength. Silence is. And I had been silent long enough. The house felt alive again. Not because of voices or footsteps, but because it remembered me. Every corner, every creak in the floorboards seemed to breathe in sync with my own heartbeat. The basement, once my prison, was now my sanctuary. The pine shelves smelled of resin, the lights cast warm pools across my workspace, and the old toms whispered stories I hadn't yet told myself. I spent hours cataloging letters, photographs, and journals, not just of my family but of myself. Of Idella, the young woman who had dreamed of history, of knowledge, of love untainted by obligation. That girl had been buried beneath decades of sacrifice. Now, I was digging her out carefully, page by page, memory by memory. Cornelius' absence was a quiet presence in the house. His warmth, his laughter, and his small, thoughtful ways remained in every corner. I often found myself in the living room, sitting in his favorite chair, remembering how he once tried, and failed, to fix a leaky faucet, his hands fumbling, his forehead creased in concentration. I smiled at the memory, a pang of sorrow mingling with gratitude. Autumn painted the garden in gold and crimson. The air smelled of wet leaves and the first frost of the season. I sat by the window, Earl Grey in hand, watching the world outside move without me. It was both beautiful and strange to live life uninterrupted by manipulation, deceit, and fear. Travant and Maya were gone, their world reduced to whispers of depths and failed ambitions. I heard from distant relatives that they moved far away, stripped of influence and recognition. Their empire, built on greed and pretense, crumbled, leaving only the ghost of a name they had never truly earned. The court had finalized everything. The house, the archives, and the legacy officially remained mine. But it was not the legal victory that filled me with satisfaction, It was the reclamation of self. The acknowledgement that I, not others, determined my path, my worth, and my voice. Neighbors and acquaintances came by, cautiously at first, then more openly, bringing flowers or simply nodding in approval. It was strange, the power of quiet respect. It was not the kind earned through fear, but through integrity and patience. I welcomed it without arrogance, knowing that no one's approval defined me anymore. Months passed. Winter arrived, turning the garden into a silver, crystalline sculpture. I spent long evenings in the basement, reading letters from my father-in-law, Langston Dubois, and from Cornelius, from times when the world had seemed simpler, full of hope and faith. Their words guided me, reminding me of love, sacrifice, and the nobility of truth over possession. I started writing my own stories. Not for court, not for relatives, not for public acclaim, but for me. For the young woman I had once been, whose curiosity and passion had been muted for decades. I catalogued her dreams alongside the histories I had kept for others. The act of writing became an act of healing. I visited Cornelius' grave often, sitting beside it, recounting small memories, speaking aloud the everyday things I wished I could have shared with him. Grief softened into warmth, a quiet understanding that his love had never left me, even in his absence. One spring morning, I found myself in the garden, planting new trees alongside the old ones, symbolizing growth, resilience, and continuity. Life, I realized, was not measured by control or ownership but by care, presence, and memory. I whispered to the soil, to the air, to the future, "This is ours. This is mine." Visitors came less often, and I liked it that way. The house no longer belonged to anyone but me. Its walls absorbed my voice, my laughter, and my tears. Its floors remembered my footsteps. Its light illuminated my solitude, my peace, and my freedom. I no longer feared silence, nor the absence of company. I had learned that freedom is a rare, delicate thing. It is not won through rage or vengeance alone, but through patience, resilience, and the courage to reclaim one's story. I looked at the photographs on the walls, myself at 20, Cornelius smiling, letters unfolded, and I understood that life had given me a second chance. Not to undo the past, but to honor it, and to move forward on my own terms. The house, once a place of confinement, became a canvas for my existence. Every corner told a story, every artifact spoke of survival, love, and memory. The archives were not just histories of the Dubois, they were testimonies to endurance, the reclamation of dignity, and the quiet triumph of truth. And in that quiet triumph, I found myself. Not as a mother defined by the ambitions of her children, nor as a widow haunted by betrayal, but as Idella Dubois, the keeper of history, the author of her own life, the woman who had finally learned to breathe freely in the home she rightfully earned. I placed a final photograph in the album, a recent one of me, in the sunlight by the garden window, hair glinting in gold, eyes calm and clear. I smiled at it, a smile unburdened by expectation or apology. The story ended not with vengeance, not with triumph over others, but with a quiet reclamation of self. I was free. Completely, finally, free. And that is where this story closes.